our attention to this morning's presentation. I wanted to mention that this is part of a series of sessions that have been an outgrowth of the CAPS and Division of Prevention Science Anti-Racism Group and Anti-Racism Initiative. And with that as background, it's my deep honor and privilege today to introduce Dr. Lisa Bowleg. She has a very long and distinguished career. She's a professor of applied social psychology in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at the George Washington University. She's also director of the Social and Behavioral Sciences Core at the DC Center for AIDS Research. She's a founding director of the GW Institute for Intersectionality, Equity, Research, and Policy, and president of the Intersectionality Training Institute, two institutes that will launch in the fall of 2021. And I've already been hassling Lisa about details for when interested scholars can sign up for these fantastic training opportunities. So this is extremely exciting. Lisa is a leading scholar of the application of intersectionality to social and behavioral science research, as well as research focused on HIV prevention and sexuality in Black communities. Specifically, her research is mixed methods and focuses on the effects of social structural context, masculinity, and resilience on Black men's sexual HIV risk and protective behaviors. Also, intersectionality, stress, and resilience among Black, lesbian, gay, and bisexual people. And in that line of research, she served as a principal investigator for NIH-funded R01 studies. So we are truly in the presence here of a superstar and a giant. Her current projects include Strengths and Stressors, a NIDA-funded R01 to examine intersectional stress, substance use, co-occurring negative health outcomes, and protective factors among Black men at different intersections of sexual identity and socioeconomic position. She also has a NIDA-funded administrative supplement to Strengths and Stressors designed to recruit and specifically focus on the experiences of Black bisexual men. A third initiative is PRISM, and an IMH-funded R21 to develop measures of multi-level intersectional stigma for Black, gay, bisexual, and other men who have sex with men in Washington, D.C. and Jackson, Mississippi. And a fourth initiative is a W.K. Kellogg Foundation-funded Intersectionality Toolkit project to develop an intersectionality checklist, case studies, and implementation manual to inform U.S. maternal and child health policy. She's an associate editor of AJPH, the American Journal of Public Health, and an editor of Perspectives from Social Sciences section of AJPH. In 2014, the American Psychological Association's Committee on Psychology and AIDS awarded her its Psychology and AIDS Distinguished Leadership Award. And I'm also very pleased to report that as of May 2021, Lisa is also the winner of the Oscar and Shoshana Trachtenberg Prize for Scholarship in Research from GW. So her work continues to just astound and inspire, and I feel so fortunate that we have her with us here this morning. Lisa and I have known each other for 20 years, and it's always so enriching and stimulating to talk with her and hear from her. So without further ado, Lisa, please take it away, and thank you so much again for being here with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction tour. Rochelle, thank you so much for the invitation. I still feel, I have to say, a little shaken by the news about John Peterson, but okay. So let me just share my screen and do you see, can you see it?
Perfect.
Okay,
yes.
Great. All right, so this is one of my shorter titles. And what I want to talk about is the importance of centering racism, even when we're talking about intersectionality. And last week, I thought Chad did such a wonderful job in introducing intersectionality and giving an overview of that. And so I'm not going to do that today. What I'm going to do is sort of position myself in this conversation about what I mean when I'm talking about centering racism, even within the context of intersectionality work and why that's so important. I want to offer a definition of racism. It's not not my definition, but it's one that I like. It's a recent one that I think really sort of spans sort of structural and individual level racism. I'm going to talk about and show you what I've written about this topic. Then I'm going to just think through, you know, this is sort of my take on like why the decentering, why we have historically decentered anti-racism and structural racism, individual racism. I'm going to be talking about them almost synonymously, although obviously I understand that they're different. And then I'm going to leave you with 6 takeaways, and I'm eager to have a conversation and learn about what you're thinking and how it applies to your research, and just have a conversation about everything I've talked about. So this is where I enter. This is my naturalization ceremony where I became a US citizen in about 2000. This is me in Rhode Island, and this is me, you know, they make you pledge and all that. And this is important because I grew up in the Bahamas. I came a predominantly Black country. And came to the US for college and ended up staying and becoming a citizen. And so much of my perspective on racism is very much the sort of insider-outsider. And so much of my sort of comfort with talking about this comes from having grown up in a predominantly Black country where all of the leaders, all of the people I admired were Black. And so I want to be very clear, because when I talk off sometimes with my African-American friends, I mean, they've said to me, this quote, like, you know, you carry yourself like you're a white man, which that's a whole other conversation, but I want to just talk about where I'm standing when I talk about racism. The second column is work that I've been doing on over the years on racial discrimination in the context of HIV prevention research. And I highlight this because you'd be surprised at how few studies there are focused specifically on racial discrimination in the context of HIV. And then the last column is what I've been writing specifically about the need to focus on racism and white supremacy, even within the context of intersectionality. So this is a definition offered by Bailey and colleagues. This is a 2021 article that just came out in the New England Journal of Medicine. And they say of this, and just move over the camera so I can see, there is no official definition of structural racism or of the closely related concepts of systemic and institutional racism, although multiple definitions have been offered. All definitions make clear that racism is not simply the result of private prejudices that individuals have, but is produced and reproduced. So this is bringing in the structural element by laws, rules, and practices, sanctions, and even implemented by various levels of government and embedded in the economic system, as well as in cultural and societal norms. Confronting racism, therefore, requires not only changing individual attitudes, but also transforming and dismantling the policies and institutions that undergird the US racial hierarchy. So again, I said, I love this definition because it really encompasses all of the different levels of what we mean when we're talking about racism. Oops. And so in terms of how I enter this is an epilogue that I wrote for Patrick Grzanka's book. He invited me to write a piece for the second edition of this book. And what I wrote was this. Mounting concern as I watch intersectionality sort of travel into these sort of mainstream conventional and professional circles is that scholars new to intersectionality, particularly white scholars who have not introspected about their own white privilege or racism, can comfortably embrace the theoretical novelty of multiple intersecting identities and yet readily ignore the role of white supremacy and racism in undergirding interlocking oppressions. And so this is something that I've seen quite a bit. Right before this call, I was reviewing a manuscript on intersectional discrimination for it's mostly LGB adults, and saw the same thing. So they had a paragraph on heterosexism and you know, homophobia and the history of Stonewall, and then they went right into intersectionality and just leapt right over racism as an example. So why the decentering? Like, there are lots of different reasons for why racism has been decentered and not at the center of these conversations, particularly in work that purports to be intersectional. And there are several reasons for this, I think. One is the obvious, that the majority of researchers are white and are doing work in disciplines where the experiences of white people are centered almost exclusively. I will show you, for example, on the left, this is a 1992 article published in American Psychologist that showed that the title of which is "Most of the Subjects Were White and Middle Class." Almost 28 years later, we have in APS, the Association for Psychological Science, their journal, an article saying pretty much the same thing, that there are very few studies, at least, and this is, to be clear, this is in my discipline, of which I'm always very critical, psychology, which is very few studies that highlight race or racism, that most of the editors are white, that most of the participants in many of the research studies are white, and so, you know, not much has changed. And you may have remember this. This was the 2010 paper about the weirdest people in the world that talked about how most of what we know about psychology comes from this sort of acronym WEIRD, people from the West, typically the US, educated populations, industrialized, rich, and people who live in democracies. And to this, where I'm writing this article, I would have added another W up for white. And on the right is this piece that came out in The Atlantic in February last year that's still talking about this problem, right? That so much of psychology, which is, you know, massive. Psychology is a very influential discipline, large undergraduate majors, lots of professionals who go on and perpetuate these same biases, that this problem is still with us, this notion that white people and white people's experiences are centered in much of the research. This is over. Another issue is that when we talk about racism, it's still often perceived through a white racial frame. White racial frame is Joe Fagan, he's a sociologist, this term he uses to describe this overwhelmingly white worldview that encompasses a broad set of stereotypes and prejudices and ideologies and images and all of that, as well as racialized inclinations to discriminate. And this is how we arrive at this. And the this in this illustration is this term perceived discrimination, which we see so often in the field, this notion, which I see as discrimination through a white racial frame, right? Because it sort of positions discrimination as something that's sort of cognitive, something that's sort of in the eye of the beholder, or that you may happen or may not happen, versus if we think about racism as structural and interlocking and mutually reinforcing with individual beliefs and prejudices, this notion of perceived discrimination I find to be sort of nonsensical, but it's sort of a white racial frame about how we talk when we talk about perceived discrimination or perceived racism. And the thing that I always say about this is that there are so many concepts in psychology that we just accept just without question. We don't talk about people's perceived self-esteem or their perceived self-efficacy. It's just self-efficacy or it's self-esteem. But when we get into this notion of sort of discrimination, we start coming in with all these sort of caveats and qualifiers. This is another example of this sort of frame, right? This was a piece that you may have seen. It was in the New York Times last Sunday, albeit with a different title. This is something that just vexes me when they keep changing the titles. The title in the actual paper was "A Moment, Not a Reckoning." And these the authors, Jennifer Chudy and Hakeem Jefferson, they wrote to talk about how after the viral video of George Floyd, there was this uptick in support for the Black Lives Matter movement. And you'll see in this diagram, in this chart in this graph on the right, that there were sort of peaks for sort of all of the groups, right, you know, in sort of March, May 2020. But Whereas there's been a decline in support for Black Lives Matter among all of the groups, you'll see that the drop-off is steepest for white people. Now, there is also an intersectional part to this story, because it's also white and Republican people, but nonetheless, it tells us something about how racism is perceived, and how it differs. The perceptions about it differ so markedly, with white people not seeing it in the sort of urgent way that people of color do. Another reason is many white people are or can choose to be epistemologically ignorant about racism. Epistemologies of ignorance are these sort of phenomenon. This is just a fantastic book for sort of laying out what it means to be epistemology ignorant. So basically, epistemology is the justification of knowledge. How does somebody know something, and how do we justify that knowledge, and whose knowledge is considered credible? And so this book defines this as, it has as its aim identifying different forms of ignorance, examining how they are produced, sustained, and what role they play in knowledge practices. And in the context of racism, what's important is that, so typically when we think about ignorance, we think about something that can be remedied by education. But epistemologies of ignorance highlight how, certain types of knowledge, or certain types of ignorance more appropriately, they're functional. They serve a purpose, and I'll talk about that in a bit. So there are different sort of types of epistemologies of ignorance. There's sort of gendered epistemologies of ignorance, racialized, but one of them is this notion of group identities and shared location, the notion that because of your experiences, you have a different sense of, what's credible, what makes sense. Alcoff, in a really interesting chapter in that book about epistemologies of ignorance, gives a story of acquaintances at a dinner party. And so somebody then shows up and talks about how an acquaintance of theirs was harassed by the police and arrested and brought up on false charges. One group of listeners, sort of questions like, well, they must have done something wrong. I mean, why would the police just sort of stop and harass you? And then another group of listeners sees this as credible and are sympathetic, right? Because based on their group identities and shared location, have a different sense of knowledge and justification of knowledge. And I wanted to just sort of show you these three examples of this. So you may have seen lots of stories like the one in the middle, that Black people were not at all surprised by what happened on January 6th, nor were they surprised, astounded, yes, but not at all surprised to see how these sort of white insurrectionists were treated with kid gloves compared to what happened with Black Lives Matter. There were no surprises there. On the right, is another example of this. Meghan's racism claims come as no surprise to Black Britons. And so, of course, many white people in the UK were clutching their pearls about what Meghan said about racism, and many Black people were like, yeah, we know. And likewise, I wanted to show this example from the New York Times about, for Black men fear that masks will invite racial profiling, because certainly it's one of the first things that I thought about early in the pandemic. And it's important because it shows from a public health perspective how we don't always understand, based on our locations, what people's motivations might be for engaging or not engaging in certain public health behaviors, in this case, wearing masks. So another type of epistemologies of ignorance is racialized epistemologies of ignorance. And this is Charles Mills, who is like pulling no punches in this book. This book is really outstanding, The Racial Contract. And what he writes, and these italics are his, what he's talking about when he's talking about racialized epistemology of ignorance is that he says this white misunderstanding, misrepresentation, evasion, and self-deception on matters related to race are among the most pervasive mental phenomena of the past few 100 years, a cognitive and moral economy that was needed for conquest, colonization, and enslavement. So again, this notion that these sort of epistemologies of ignorance, whether it's sort of color blinding, it's whether it's, you know, belief in just societies, whether it's the sort of erasure of racism in explaining health inequities, all of that, that it's functional. This is not something that can just be sort of remedied through education. So then another reason is, of course, all the negative stuff, right? So, you know, the guilt, the discomfort, the shame, the anger, all of that, a term that Robin DiAngelo calls in her book white fragility. And this quote is very long, but I think it's important, which is why I included here. So this is what she's talking about when she's talking about, you know, this is the title of her book. Socialize into a deeply internalized sense of superiority that she's talking about white people, either are unaware of or can never admit to ourselves. We become highly fragile in conversations about race. We consider a challenge to our racial worldviews as a challenge to our very identities as good, moral people. Thus, we perceive any attempt to connect us to the system of racism as an unsettling and unfair moral offense. The smallest amount of racial stress is intolerable. The mere suggestion that being white has meaning often triggers a range of defensive responses. These include emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and withdrawal from the stress-inducing situation. Other reasons. Another reason for the decentering is that in most of the disciplines in which we've been trained, individual level frameworks predominate. In fact, in my training as an applied social psychologist, everything I learned was mostly about individual level frameworks, right? And so these are some of the big ones: the theory of reason action, stages of change, health belief model, social cognitive theory. One possible exception is the social ecological model, but even in this model, it does not explicitly name racism and structural discrimination. But I think this also sort of shapes how we see the world, because we don't really learn about factors beyond the level of the individual. And related to that, formal opportunities to learn critical frameworks that really are all about exposing power relations and justifying knowledge and what happens to maintain racialized and economic status quo. You often have to get that elsewhere. You got to get that in women's studies, or you got to get that at a seminar. Those are not sort of integrated in most of the theoretical and methodological training that people who go on to do health equity research get. And this is unfortunate, right? Because had we gotten this type of stuff in our training, and maybe it's changed. My experience tells me it hasn't. We would be learning about critical race theory and the sort of posits of critical race theory. One that I have on the screen, that racism is not this sort of anomalous or aberrant thing, but for people of color in the US, it is routine, ordinary and seemingly fixed fact of life. It is central to pretty much everything that happens in our country. And so here are just sort of two examples of how critical theories are traveling in public health, which is exciting. So this Chandra Ford's paper and Collins Ahenbua's paper on critical race theory. And what I love about this paper is they talk about the importance of not just documenting inequities. That's not the role of any critical work, but how do we engage in praxis to do the sort of dismantling that we saw in the definition of racism that I showed you earlier. And then this is my 2012 paper about intersectionality and why I think it's such an indispensable framework for public health. And as I said, Chad did such an excellent job on that last week, so there's no need for me to go into that. Another problem is what I call the gatekeepers, the editors and reviewers who police or stop discussions about racism. This was an article in the Washington Post earlier this year, and it's about a faculty member who does work with David Williams on racism, talking about doing a paper where the editors demanded that they take out the word racism, and how he's decided he's not doing that anymore. And, you know, so that is a really sort of entrenched example of the policing of discourse around racism. And then you've seen this article before, but I wanted to show it again because the editors in this review also talk about the role of white editors in sort of policing what's said or what can be said about racism, and using that term, and, you know, asking authors to, you know, sort of contort themselves and say, oh, everything else but name what we're talking about, which is racism. And then, of course, there are a lot of penalties for even sort of Black and other researchers of color who talk about racism and who do this type of work. One of the most recent and egregious examples of this that you may have heard of is Nikole Hannah-Jones. Nikole Hannah-Jones, who has won a Pulitzer Prize. Nikole Hannah-Jones, who's won a MacArthur Fellowship, and who was instrumental in the New York Times 1619 project on the history and legacy of slavery. The Board of Trustees, even though overruled her getting tenure at UNC because of the work she does. Also, critical race theory has been under fire. It started with Trump, and it's still continuing. And this is the African American Policies Forum talking about, you know, this sort of assault on critical race theory. And so intersectionality will not be far behind. Intersectionality comes out of critical race theory, in fact. And how these states now, a dozen states, are introducing this legislation that is basically trying to prohibit the teaching of racism, because it says, you know, all the stuff you might imagine. It's making white people feel uncomfortable, or, you know, it's just leftist propaganda, and so on and so forth. So this is sort of another reason for the decentering of these topics. So some takeaways. We need to become structurally competent in the field. Structural competence is this is such a wonderful paper. I really love this paper, and I find uses for it in all sorts of different dimensions. But basically, Metzel and Hansen are sort of talking about the need for sort of medical trainees to learn how to become more competent about deriving structural explanations for health behaviors, right? So an example here is, you know, of a Black patient, and she's late, and how easy it would be to sort of slip into these sort of racist cultural stereotypes, where they talk about, you know, recognizing sort of structures such as, you know, does she have to take a bus? Where does she live? And so I don't have time to get into all of these different ways, but I think this also is a framework for how we need to learn to think about structural racism and structural factors in general. And it's been heartening to see in COVID that more structural discourse sort of coming in, specifically on structural racism. This is the Selden and Berdahl paper, and where they wanted to look at inequities in COVID. And so they did the race and ethnicity analyses, but they went a step further. They wanted to know about, you know, how job characteristics, how household composition, where people lived, what impact that had on COVID. And they found that, you know, Black people at high risk for severe illness were 1.6 times more likely as white people to live in households that had people who worked in the healthcare sector. And for Latino adults, it was 64.5% who lived in households where at least one person couldn't work from home, thereby increasing risk, versus 56.5% among Black adults and only 46.6% among whites. And this on the right is what they headed in their discussion which I have to say I found so refreshing to see in a journal such as Health Affairs. I mean, they named it, right? Disparities in COVID-19 outcomes likely stem from structural racism on many levels. This is a welcome antidote to these sort of approaches that just cite race as the problem, race as the risk factor. And we do that all the time. We do that in HIV. We do with a bunch of inequities, rather than it's the discrimination or the discrimination based on race that is the problem, not the race in and of itself. That we need to learn to ask, where is the racism in this? And from this, I go to Marie Matsuda, who is a critical race scholar. And she talks about this, asking the other question that she does to really see intersectionality. But I think it's really important and something that we can also apply to racism. And so she talks about the way I try to understand the interconnections of all forms of subordination is through a method I call ask the other question. When I see something that looks racist, I ask, where's the patriarchy in this? When I see something that looks sexist, I ask, where's the heterosexism in this? And when I see something that looks homophobic, I ask, where are the class interests in this? And I think that generally speaking, what we need to do is also ask, well, where's the racism in this? Like, too often we get stuck on the individual level factors, or we retreat to the areas that we're comfortable, sort of going back to the example I was telling you about the paper I was reviewing on intersectional discrimination with LGBT adults that just focused on the heterosexism part. If you're doing intersectional work, all positions are of equal interest. And so you have to absolutely also center experiences of racism. And I wanted to show you just an example from one of my studies. We did a study a few years ago. This was one of my past R01s, where I really wanted to understand sort of neighborhood context and what that could tell us about HIV risk and protective behaviors. And this is a quote that's stuck with me ever since. And so one of the things we wanted to ask, so this is a mixed method study. What we first did was we did focus groups in 9 different neighborhoods throughout DC, different socioeconomic, neighborhoods of different socioeconomic status, all Black men. And then we also did a quantitative phase where we developed measures based on what we learned in this phase. And so one of the things we wanted to ask in the focus group was, where's HIV, rank on your list? And one of the respondents says it's like number 9 of 10. Another respondent says not on our list at all. You can see Saunders, violent cop, but you can't see AIDS. The police is on the forefront of what's going on here 24 hours a day. You can't see the AIDS coming. You focus on what you're dealing with. Here, your surrounding. So a very cursory analysis of this would be to talk about how, their low risk perception, or, how they're sort of deluded about HIV, and ignore what they're saying here. They're talking about the centrality of structural racism and how that pretty much overwhelms everything else. And so as a result of this, we didn't ask any explicit questions about police brutality in this study. But as a result of this, we then went on to create quantitative measures about police brutality. And so I've been doing a lot of work in that area. But the point is the importance of sort of centering racism when we're even within, especially within HIV work. As I said before, avoiding race and ethnicity as explanatory variables in and of themselves. It's something that we do so often and that we see done often. This is an article in Science magazine. It was published last year, where they are, appealing and advocating to NIH to stop using just race as an explanatory variable for our health inequities. And what they say here is that although genetic risk factors may contribute to the severity of COVID-19, race is a poor proxy to understand the distribution of risk factors for COVID. Compelling evidence shows that racism, not race, is the most relevant risk factor. The importance of racially and ethnically diverse research teams with people of color in meaningful roles, particularly in our work with communities of color, community-based organizations. Researchers of color, I have to highlight a forthcoming article in Health, Education, and Behavior that I wrote invoking one of my heroes, Audre Lorde. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. 10 critical lessons for Black and other health equity researchers of color. There's a need for, because there's so much risk for early career scholars within their departments, within what they're publishing or what's not going to get published, because they're talking about racism and other things that make many white people who have power uncomfortable. So I wanted to write a piece with sort of 10 lessons, including the need for social support, particularly for researchers of color. And last but not least, the importance of white people and white researchers doing and taking responsibility for doing your anti-racism work. And this is something that I also wrote about in that piece that I showed you earlier. Scholars interested in intersectionality, whether on a quest for a novel and innovative framework, because I do think that that's one of the reasons why intersectionality has traveled so far. I mean, it's certainly intuitively appealing, but I think that for some researchers, they glom onto it because like, oh, this is new and we need something innovative for our innovation section. And or because of a commitment to social justice, must wade into the troubled waters of theorizing, talking, and writing explicitly about white supremacy and racism. White scholars must introspect about their own racism and white privilege and learn the strategies of anti-racism practice and how to facilitate critical conversations about racism and interlocking oppression, particularly with other white people. That last part is important because there's a way that talking about racism with scholars of color or your colleagues of color can be re-traumatizing. And so I think this is really the sort of work that white people need to do together. My idea of horror is anytime I hear that our department or something wants to do diversity training, because like, oh Jesus, I mean, I don't want to sit there and be sort of re-traumatized by people's stories of being racist or hearing something racist. And so I really think this is work that needs to happen within groups of white people. And to that end, these are sort of 3 books that really took off last year in the wake of all of these sort of unrest in response to the George Floyd murder. And I'm going to end there and invite your questions, comments, feedback. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Lisa. That was amazing, mind-blowing. So my pea brain is trying to absorb all of it, but this is really terrific. So I see one question in the chat from Dale. He asks, what does critical mean when we say critical conversations about racism?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, critical comes from this sort of whole genre of critical theories, of which there are many. Intersectionality is one, critical race theory is one, queer theory is one. And that slide that I showed earlier about what critical theories are, which are about exposing power relations that are often hidden. And so a critical conversation about race is about talking about the structures that uphold racism and about being very sort of candid and clear about that. And that we're not just talking about racism as some interpersonal thing, some interpersonal individual level thing that, you know, this person is racist to that person. It's really about getting into the sort of racism as a whole system and structure.
Great, thank you. Okay, thank you, Rochelle. I am not able to see raised hands. I'm looking at the chat.
I see Monique.
Monique has her hand up. So Monique, would you like to come on the line and ask your question?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, this is an honor and a pleasure. And believe me, I say it with great respect when I call you one of my citations. So I'm trying to be cool, even though I'm talking to one of my citations. First, I had a comment. Speaking of intersectionality, I would have pointed to the Black feminist thought and the Combahee River Collective and going all the way back to Ain't I a Woman, proceeding critical race theory on that. And the question I have is, I don't know if I'm guessing you might be a part of these Spirits of 1848 conversations.
I am.
Because what I'm noticing is there's a dynamic. It's the same old, isn't it just SES? And this destroys me. I find it's intellectually dishonest, and it's a way of, why do you have to keep bringing up racism? It's so, and it's it's presented as your analysis is incomplete. When what in point of fact is, my question is, what's your thought on that? Those are my.
You've summed it up. You've summed it up beautifully. I think that often when we go with that, but the what about is that it then just takes you right off center. It takes you right off center from talking about racism. Of course, these are intersecting race and class, and that's a conversation to have. And I think we need to talk about, of course, sort of intersections with class and whiteness and all of that, but that's an example of the decentering that I mean, that all of a sudden you're now having another conversation. It's sort of like when people are talking about, like sexual violence, gendered sexual violence, and someone, invariably, or this happens in my classes, invariably, some student will say, well, there are men who are raped too. Well, yeah, that's true too. But if we focus on that in the context of what I'm talking about sort of gendered racism or violence against women and trans people, look at how that gets us off center. And so I think, I find the same frustration, and I've seen those conversations too. And I just move on. I never comment. It's like, this is not going to derail my day. I'm moving on. That's my response to that.
Okay, Susan asks, what do you think about the construct of caste as Wilkerson has written about?
Oh, yes. I find that really compelling. I find that to be I find Wilkerson's conceptualization of caste to be a very compelling framework for understanding how skin color works in the US, to keep you, no matter this notion that you can't move out of it. Her in the book, she gives that really searing example of, she's going to give an interview. I think she's an interview with, she set up this interview with someone. She arrives, the guy says he can't talk to her, he's really busy, he's meeting a New York Times researcher, a New York Times reporter, and she says, but I'm that person. He couldn't even sort of see past that because of skin color, right? So she's from the New York Times, she's got the business card and everything. And so I think that notion of caste really captures so well what the dynamic is in our country as well. You can't, Barack Obama has this story about, he was being a senator and he was still being asked to valet park cars. The police, really wealthy, famous Black people still being trailed by police. Says to me, there's almost sort of immutable, despite all these myths we tell ourselves about this society where it's, merit and you can transcend these, the evidence that people of color can do that in the US successfully is not compelling, at least to me.
All right. Other questions? If you have questions, please either raise your hand and Rochelle will identify you if you'd like to come on the line and ask, or feel free to type questions in the chat.
Jay.
Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Jay.
Thank you so much for this incredible presentation. It's just always so enlightening and informative. I have five to 10 books new on my list to read as a result. I really love this concept that you introduced, structural competency. And
not my term, that's Metzel and Hansen, but I just find it to be really sort of a term that we can borrow for our work as well. Yes,
exactly. I was wondering if you could say more about structural competency in the context of intersectionality as sort of an emergent lens within the realm of public health, specifically, where NIH and other entities have really focused funding on more individual level or kind of lower level processes, and how we might think about structural competency and applying it more to the work that we do in HIV.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, I was, of course, thrilled when NIH expressed their interest in intersectionality, but as I've criticized, it's also been a very individualized lens, right? So even on their website, they defined intersectional stigma as multiply stigmatized identities. I'm like, well, wait, that's problematic for a whole bunch of reasons. Because one, there's nothing inherently negative about, you know, being Black, being a person of color, being trans, none of that. It's really about what the oppression based on those identities. And so I think what needs to happen is, and what is happening, I just reviewed this morning, the first report out from the intersectional stigma. You know, there are going to be all these papers published. Jay, you are part of that endeavor for the summer NIH intersectional stigma workshop. And one of the overarching papers is talking about the need for structure, that we need to be talking about intersecting structures, not identities. And so this is something I'm trying to do in my work. I'm really trying to shift the focus from intersecting identities. It's just too, well, first of all, everybody has an intersecting identity. So it makes no sense to talk about people with multiple identities. What does that mean? Every single person, every human has multiple identities. And so what we're really talking about is how power and privilege structure health outcomes for different groups based on these intersectional positions. The other problem with the whole stigmatized identities language is it avoids or it ignores the role of context. So yeah, you're in this country, you're African American and stigmatized, but you take this person, you fling them in Jamaica, totally different experience, totally different kid. And so it sort of loses the role of context. But I think that, to get back to your initial question, we also need to learn, what does it mean to do structure in research, right? And so I think of ways like, so for me, and I think it's probably because I have my master's is in public policy, and I did work as a policy analyst, an HIV policy analyst for so many years. And so I think I have a structural lens built in. And so, for example, one simple way to deal with this is when we talk about demographics, bring in the role of structure. It's not just unemployment, or it's not just incarcerate, people who are unemployed, blah, blah. There's a reason that explains why, if your participants were Black or Latino, they're much more likely to be unemployed than white people. And so I think the onus is on researchers to bring in structure, go to the Bureau of Labor, bring that in. Bringing data from the Department of Corrections, bring in structure to orient readers, even if it's individual level research, about how structure is impinging on the experiences and outcomes of the people who are structured at the most marginalized intersections. Did I answer? I put a lot in there. Did I?
Yes, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Terrific. Other questions for Lisa?
Judy, this is wonderful. I feel like I'm like with family. I know everybody that I'm seeing. Hi, Judy. Can't hear you.
Fabulous presentation, Lisa, as always. Really, really wonderful. I know I'm a broken record and everyone's sick of hearing me say these things. I put it in the chat. I was hoping I could just drop it there and leave it there. But the biggest bugaboo I have in all of these discussions is the marginalization, exclusion of social science, not psychological science, but social science, particularly that which sociologists, political scientists, and anthropologists, maybe even economists do, social welfare scholars, which is by definition focusing on structures and systems and institutions. And we could have a whole long discourse, as many of us have had over the decades, about why that's happened and how it's manifest. But it seems to me a very important part of the conversation is about how all of us should be responsible, take responsibility if we care about these issues, as you have, to read outside our own disciplinary literature and to go back to the roots of things where, like Meredith Tershin years ago wrote about structural violence. Nobody reads this stuff anymore, or they've never been exposed to it. So rather than reinventing terms and constructs or appropriating them, as I see MDs, like infectious disease docs, doing during COVID, where all of a sudden they're now the experts in health equity. They're the experts in social determinants of health. So there's this dilemma about the absence of familiarity with literature and thinking that already exists, but people just aren't exposed to or choose to not expose themselves to. Then a kind of a reinvention of it by new folks who are not trained in those disciplines, and an appropriation of the terminology, like you've talked about for intersectionality. On the one hand, it's nice that folks are getting this in their brains and the universe, but they're not necessarily fully comprehending what it actually means to the people who have constructed them and thought a lot about them. Same with social determinants of health. Terribly contested as a frame even in social science, even though that's where the notion comes from about being too deterministic, too linear, things like that. I would really appreciate your thoughts about how to get folks to just read the other literature, pay attention to things. How do we get sociologists as program officers at the NIH instead of just only psychologists being seen as the ones closest to medical research, ergo they're the ones we're going to hire for health research. Those are some institutional issues and structural issues we as a scientific community ourselves have to contend with. Being familiar with the right literature, allowing the people who actually have thought through these things to be the spokespersons about them, to speak from a place of their own research and science. And that includes theory like critical race theory and feminist theory and so on. So sorry, I'm babbling on, but
well, no, but I mean, you've highlighted part of the problems, because I mean, I think so much of my work is influenced by sociology, and I have a very sort of multidisciplinary background. But the fact that, I think about Kim Blankenship's work on structural approaches. Kim's a sociologist. So much of that, but you explained why it is that psychologists and psychology has been, sort of heralded as the sort of science because it's close enough to the biomedical perspective. But I agree with you. I have nothing to add.
Yeah, I think it's no coincidence that disciplines that are critical and cause us to be uncomfortable in their work are more likely to be marginalized. So it's not an accident, unfortunately.
That's right. Perfectly said.
Right. And it's safer to actually allow the folks who are not necessarily trained in them, which is the reverse way of saying to invite the folks who are appropriating the terminologies in a way that sounds a lot safer. It's much easier to let those folks be the spokesperson than to actually go to the radical thinkers and scholars of the social sciences, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
One quick question. I have one of our fellows, Miranda Hill, would like to ask a question. Miranda, would you like to unmute?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, Lisa. This is actually my second time meeting you. I met you as a doc student at APHA one year and conjured up the courage to ask you for some advice, and look now where I am. But what
did I say? I hope I gave good advice.
You gave me great advice. I was trying to look on how to recruit, and you had your street team. You were telling me like street recruitment strategies. It's always great to hear from you. I have a question. You made suggestions for supporting early career investigators and other faculty of color. And my question is in reference to the policies that need to be had to support minorities who are usually experiencing minority tax. Minority tax in the form of being asked to facilitate diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also in terms of the amount of effort that we have to put into engaging marginalized communities, and how that impacts our productivity in terms of writing, and also the lack of emotional distance that we can have from actually writing about topics such as this. So I guess advice on both ends from institutions and individuals alike.
That piece that I showed, the master's tools, I talk about 10, I give 10 individual level lessons based on my own experience, but then I also include a table for each of the lessons that for departments, universities, professional organizations like journals and so on, and for NIH, because I agree with you wholeheartedly. So much of this is structural, right? And so departments need to know why they need to protect early career scholars and why they can't go on the Be Black for Me tour every February and be doing every, Black History Month this and that it does pull you away from your research. And also in terms of the tax, that, for example, a structural thing that needs to happen is then everybody in the department needs to be trained and be responsible for that type of service. There's so many different things that need to happen structurally, but also people need to sort of understand this. And so I know exactly what you mean. And yes, and the emotional toll. One of my mentees texted a few weeks ago. She was supposed to be given a presentation on racist trauma. And it was, after the verdict and the Toledo, and she couldn't give the presentation because she was just so sort of traumatized by all of this. And so there also needs to be sort of an understanding of what that experience is like. And you're right to point out, these are not individual level issues necessarily. There are things that departments and universities can do. So I just want to echo Miranda. So my thoughts on it are, yes, you're totally right. I got nothing to add.
All right, well, we are at the top of the hour, so please join me in thanking Lisa for this stellar presentation and extremely stimulating Q&A. I feel revitalized and fired up. So thank you, Lisa, so much for spending an hour of your precious day with us, and 1,000 thank yous from all of us.
It was my pleasure.
Yes, bravo.